I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars. Next to me is the new Renault Megane E-Tech. Well, I say new, and that's because the Megane E-Tech has only been on sale here in Australia for a few months. And today is our first detailed test of the vehicle here on Chasing Cars, meaning we'll be testing this car across a broad range of contexts here on Australian roads. Now, when Renault announced the Megane E-Tech for Australia, the price was about $70,000 drive away, which looked pretty expensive for a fairly compact and fairly mainstream electric vehicle. Well, before the car even hit the road, that price had been slashed by about $10,000 to around 60 grand drive away. Technically a limited price. The day on which we're filming is technically the last day of availability of that price, but I'd wager it'll either be extended or it should be extended. Personally, I wouldn't pay over 60 grand drive away for this car. That being said, the Megane E-Tech gets a lot of things right, and I'm going to take you through what those are in today's video. I'll also let you know where this vehicle has a few shortcomings generally, and also in terms of its Australian spec. We'll look at the interior, the backseat and the boot, discuss the running costs, and then take a drive in the Megane E-Tech. But before we get started, please hit subscribe down below. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Direct. In terms of range and charging for the Megane E-Tech, here in Australia we only get the big battery version, which is to say the EV60 variant with a 60 kilowatt hour usable battery. Charging is actually done here on the front left 3/4 panel, where we have a little manual door that opens up nice and easily, emblazoned with something looking like the Renault crest. Once you get in there, you find the Type 2 and CCS style plug, and we come to another deletion for the Australian market. In Europe, the Megane E-Tech has 3-phase capability. Here in Australia, it's stripped back to single phase, which simply means that if you get a single phase wall box, you'll easily charge this thing overnight, but you can't benefit from the much faster, up to 22 kilowatt 3-phase charging that this vehicle offers in Europe. DC is up to 130 kilowatts, which is fine, though nothing to write home about. In terms of the range that I've been getting from the car, in my mixed driving, I've seen an efficiency of 16 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers very reliably from this vehicle, which is a range of 375 kilometers. Now, if you really baby it, you can get it down towards that 15 or even high 14s, which is going to put you around that 400 Ks of range. On the highway, driven sportily, you'll expect to see maybe around that 350 kilometer mark, which is acceptable for a vehicle which is, I think, positioned as more of a town car. In terms of a long-legged highway cruiser, the E-Tech isn't going to be the easiest to live with because its battery is fairly small and its charging speed isn't that ambitious. Jumping into the interior of the Megane E-Tech, we discover a bit of a quirk of the Australian spec of this car, and that's that while outside, our E-Tech looks like a top-of-the-range car, and it's called EV60 Techno, which corresponds to the top-end Megane E-Tech. The interior has had a few features stripped out compared to the top-of-the-range vehicles that you'd see in France, the UK, other markets in Europe. It starts with the screen. So we have a smaller screen here in Australia. It's 9 inches in size, and it's not embarrassingly small or anything like that. It's still, has good functionality. It's relatively easy to navigate and has wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. But in other markets, top-end E-Techs have a larger screen than this, and they also have built-in Google as the operating system of the car. We don't have that here. We just have a standard Renault operating system. So if you want the latest and greatest, the Aussie spec of this car is just not going to give it to you. We do have a big 12-inch digital instrument cluster, however, which looks really crisp, but because we don't have Android on board, we don't even have integrated sat-nav of any kind. You can't do anything like put your maps in front of you. Nowhere in the world does Renault offer leather in the Megane E-Tech. Instead, we have a textile-based interior, which is like a grey cloth, sort of green stitching and some vinyl along the sides of the seat. The seat itself looks really lush, and in fact the interior is quite textural and quite sophisticated and chic. But unfortunately for me, the seat isn't that comfortable. It's sort of nominally plush and soft, and you feel like it's comfy when you first sit in it, but the seat base is so flat. So if you have longer legs, you're going to find your legs just floating as you're driving along in the car, and you can't adjust that seat base. So for me, it doesn't work, but seats are so specific, you'd have to go to the dealership and take one for a test drive to see how it works for you. They are manually adjustable, which is fine as long as you're not having to share the car too much. you've got power lumbar and seat heating, which is nice to have. No premium audio in our spec, nor can you option anything like that. No panoramic roof, and you can't option that either. Again, features that just aren't present here in Australia, but at least the stock stereo sounds pretty good. Steering wheel feels great in the hand. Convenient paddle shifters for the regen. Quite a lot going on the spokes with touch capacitive buttons, but it doesn't take too long to learn what's going on. And then we have a lot of stalks, the gears, indicators, wipers, and even audio controls hidden behind the steering wheel. Bit of a learning curve, more than in some other cars. Once you get your head around it, it all works pretty well. Material's generally nice, so sort of cloth up here on the dashboard, you've got some metal, everything's sort of integrated nicely, little phone holder here as well, but doesn't take too long to go looking and find some cheaper plastics, which is how they get this car to the price that it's at. Is it worth 60 grand drive away? Well, if you're after something a little bit different, a little bit chic and sophisticated and quirky in that French way, as much of a cliche as that is, you might want to consider the Renault. The fact that a base Tesla Model Y is now about this price probably blows this car away theoretically on value, but I suspect that a lot of people who are interested in a Megane E-Tech are not interested whatsoever in the Tesla. That's the front seat. Let's check out the back. Moving to the back seat of the Megane E-Tech, this vehicle is a real triumph of packaging. Its dimensions are genuinely compact, and we'll put them on the screen here, and in particular, the length is amazingly tight. So if you do have a small garage or you live in a congested suburb with not a great deal of street parking, the Megane E-Tech will make life easy. And yet, here in the back seat, as you can see behind my driving position, there's actually quite generous legroom. Now, I'm 6 foot or 183 centimeters. Headroom's good. Again, we have no sunroof in this car, which does help. Legroom's good. Tow room, however, is a bit tight. The other problem is that because we're sitting on a 60 kilowatt hour battery here in a relatively tight frame, we are driven up in terms of our height here in the back. So the seat base, again, not angled up enough, so legs are sort of floating. You'd have to splay them on a longer trip to get comfortable. Not really the biggest issue in the world, and for short trips, this vehicle is really good for carrying 4 adults. You do have a 5th seat here. It's getting a little bit tight and compact. No flip down armrest is a bit of a shame, but we do have air vents, which is good to see, and 2 USB-C ports here in the back. All hard touch plastics here, but at least a soft little armrest down here. One thing is, it does start to feel a tiny bit claustrophobic in the back. The windows themselves, just big enough. The rear window is absolutely tiny, probably why they've fitted a standard rear view mirror in this car to try and help on the visibility front. Moving around the back of the Megane E-Tech now, it's worth pointing out the dramatic styling of this small car. And it is small, and it is a car. In photos, it almost looks like a mid-size SUV, but its dimensions are very compact. The huge wheels are pushed right out to the corners. It's actually quite stunning in the flesh. And on these big 20s, as Renault has equipped it with as standard for Australia, it's so bold. I think it might be the best looking small car out there. You can let me know what you think down below. Now we've got a full width light bar, flat Renault logo, and then a little sort of greeny gold highlight on the last E in Megane to remind you it is electric, but it does not have an electric tailgate. It has a button that sort of looks like it's going to cause it to open in a powered sense, but for Australia, this vehicle does not have a power tailgate. It's manual, but it's light and easy. 440 litres of space in there. Doesn't quite look that big to me, but that's what the figure says. It is quite deep, and then there is also some underfloor storage too for your charging cables or other paraphernalia. Quite easy to close, because again, the height of this vehicle isn't too tall, so even those who are not that tall in stature will be able to grab that boot handle. And in terms of the running costs, they're not too bad. Servicing over 5 years or 150,000 kilometers equates to about $1,600 here in Australia, but you still do have to service the vehicle annually, even though the kilometer limit is 30,000 Ks per year. And in terms of the warranty, Renault's a bit below par here. 5 years or 100,000 kilometers on the car, but the battery warranty is the standard 8-year, 160,000 kilometer affair. All right, let's take a drive in the Renault Megane E-Tech. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, the version of this car that we get here in Australia is the EV60 Techno. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Unfortunately, we don't have any other variants. We don't have any other wheel sizes, battery sizes, power levels. This is it. But thankfully, the way the E-Tech is set up is pretty sweet. And if you like driving, and in particular, if you like relatively powerful front-wheel drive hot hatches, you'll find quite a lot that's familiar about the Megane E-Tech. And that might be if you've loved combustion Meganes or combustion Clio RSs, cars like that in the past, because there's quite a lot of that spirit here in the electric Megane. And that's great, because although a lot of car makers are introducing EVs, not all of them have stayed true to the philosophy of the brand they come from. Think of like the new Lotus EVs, which are like, I don't know, the best part of 3 tons once you put some passengers in them. That's not what Lotus is about. But Renault is about spirited cars, often front drive, nice and light, lots of feel when you're driving them. And that's exactly what you get in the Megane E-Tech, and I'm delighted about that. So, what is the mechanical package that we've got here? Well, under the skin, the Megane E-Tech uses the Renault Nissan CMF EV platform. So this is a dedicated front-wheel drive based electric car architecture. And it's one of the main reasons that the Megane E-Tech is packaged pretty well. Okay, it doesn't have a frunk, which is a little annoying if you're used to that, if you already own an EV with one. But this car is really pushed out to the corners in terms of the cabin, and it's really big inside. It's also really efficient, which is often a mark of a well-calibrated EV platform. And I think that's exactly what we've got here. It might be front-wheel drive, which has some drawbacks of its own, but this car does feel pretty well calibrated in terms of its motor, and it does return good efficiency. So one front motor with 160 kilowatts of power, which is not too powerful in the scheme of things of how much power EVs can have. For instance, a base Model Y has over 200 kilowatts of power. But what we have here is a lot less weight than in many other EVs. So we're under 1,700 kilos before I get into the car, which is a real achievement in itself. I mean, it should be relatively light because it's not the biggest car on the road, but we know there are just so many porky EVs out there, and it's refreshing that this isn't one of them. There's no all-wheel drive version of the Megane E-Tech available anywhere, although the platform can support it because we have seen all-wheel drive versions of the Nissan Ariya, which uses the same basic underpinnings as this car. And notably, you can't get the Ariya in Australia. But I have driven one before, and I can tell you that the tuning differences between a Megane E-Tech and an Ariya are pretty significant, because this car does feel like a true Renault to drive. It's really perky, particularly when you put it into the sport mode through the multi-sense button here on the steering wheel, and throttle response is excellent. It's also quite a quick car. We have timed it, and it returned a 0 to 100 time of just under 7 seconds, which is certainly quick enough. And if you're coming from sort of a regular kind of hatchback or SUV, this will immediately feel quite quick because it has that instant torque off the line. That's a function of most EVs. But actually, the Megane E-Tech kind of keeps pulling quite hard and even returns a decent quarter-mile time. For most of my week of testing, I drove the vehicle around in eco mode, however, seeing how much efficiency I could eke out of the battery, and it did pretty well, but it feels a bit doughy in eco, so if you prefer that sort of perky driving dynamic with rapid-fire throttle response that was sort of reminiscent of naturally aspirated Clios and stuff of the past, you'll want to put it into sport. Now, putting it into sport doesn't actually change many of the other dynamics because we have passive dampers here, no adaptive dampers, and although we do have electric power steering, one thing I really like about the sport mode in the Megane is it doesn't add really silly, unnecessary weight to the steering, which is often something we see in cars because for whatever reason, manufacturers and I think some customers associate this artificial heavy steering with sportiness. And at least from my perspective, heavy steering doesn't necessarily mean sporty. It kind of means like a muscle car, and the Megane E-Tech is definitely not a muscle car. In fact, the handling and the ride handling balance as a whole is very much front drive, hot hatch-esque. There's sort of a degree of softness to the chassis here, and Renault does not call this vehicle an RS for a reason, but it always feels distinctly front drive. And on a wet, greasy day like today, that does have its drawbacks because we get a fair bit of wheel spin coming out of corners. You just plant your foot down, immediately you feel that inside wheel start to spin up. It does mean that if you're after sort of rear-wheel drive thrills and a little bit of that power oversteer sensation, this is not the EV for you. And I make that point because rivals at the similar price point to this car, like the Cupra Born, do offer rear-wheel drive, and even much cheaper ones like the MG4, again, rear-wheel drive, and so some drivers will prefer that. I personally see front drive as a slight disadvantage for this car, but again, we've got to think about the kind of people that will be inherently drawn to the Megane E-Tech, and a big proportion of those people will be Renault fans who already like the idea of a front-wheel drive hot hatch. And that's what this vehicle is giving you. It's giving you the pace, it's giving you the front end zeal and turn in, and it's giving you the balance of a hot hatch with full electrification without having to add too much weight. Now, old Clios and Meganes were a lot lighter than this car, I recognize that. But compared to common EVs, the Megane E-Tech is nice and light, and that is something to be celebrated. Now, the body sits nice and flat in the corners. The chassis feels really rigid, and this particular test car is also extremely tight with no creaks or rattles. The build quality seems absolutely excellent in the car that I've been allocated, which is definitely something that's noteworthy. One big drawback, I would say, is the ride. Now, the core damping of the Megane is actually pretty good, and over undulations and country roads, it's settled and relatively comfortable. Where it trips up is if the 20-inch wheels find expansion joints, potholes, complex bumps with sharp edges. They just can't cope. And even though the vehicle has relatively nice damping, the compliance ultimately isn't there because we're on massive alloy wheels with virtually no profile in the tire to help out in a passive sense. So a car that sort of is, I guess, on the face of it quite comfortable and quite well damped can quickly become a bit coarse and crashy over the sorts of bumps that tend to open up over winter on rainy days like the one we're testing the car on here in Sydney. So in terms of ride, there are better EVs out there. In a way, it's a bit of a shame there isn't a Megane spec on smaller wheels here in Australia, because I reckon the combination of this car's nice damping and a bit more tyre from a smaller alloy wheel would be an excellent mix. That being said, hard to blame Renault for only bringing in one relatively high spec to start with, because Australia is a small market and the volume just isn't there for Renault to have a complicated range at this point. So it's a compromise that I'm certainly willing to accept. Another thing I will note though, and it's something that's particularly come out on this wet day on this country road that I like to use, is that there's not a huge amount of grip, which a lot of people will find quite fun, but you do have to be a little patient at times. So because we've got those big 20s, it's a sort of interesting combination of a really big diameter on the wheel, but then we've got quite a skinny tire, so only 215 tires on this car. They're Goodyear efficient grip, so not a particularly sporty tire. And I've found that at about 7/10, like going around that corner with a bit of heat, you're starting to scrub quite quickly. Again, you sort of feel like you're cross-country skiing, dancing a bit with the car. It's quite fun, but ultimately, again, this isn't a Megane E-Tech RS. It's not claiming to have those sky-high levels of grip or stiffness. I'd love to see Renault do one of those because this platform would really suit transition into being an RS. Refinement is okay. It's a little bit coarse in the cabin, but again, it's quieter than a lot of other Renaults that I've driven in the past, so it's not bad. Visibility, I would say, is a big drawback. The rear window aperture is so narrow and the headrests are in the way. I sort of pop this digital rear view mirror on. It's not great. It's covered in water. It actually barely increases my visibility, so seeing out the back, not easy in this car. In terms of the safety, it's not bad. So we do have adaptive cruise control as standard in this car, and we've got a lane keeping assistant, but interestingly, it's not a super high-end one, and if you turn it off, the car remembers that. So if you come back the next day, your lane keeping is still off. Now, traditionalists will really like that, and personally I like that, because if I don't want lane keeping, I just don't want it, and you can easily turn it back on at the touch of a button down here on the panel. But it's not the strongest system in terms of holding you in the center of the lane. Instead, I found it does have road exit mitigation even when lane keeping's turned off. So if you brush up against the edge of the road, it is going to give you some guidance through the steering back into your lane. But it's a fairly low touch system. Also, we don't have an audible speed warning here. A lot of people will like that, and I'm glad we don't have an audible warning because the speed sign recognition in this car is really not great. So about half the time when I've looked down at the speed limit, I've found it reading something erroneous. So if it was yelling and screaming at me for being at the wrong speed when it still thinks I'm in a 40 zone, but I've been in a 60 for a few minutes, that would be frustrating. Thankfully, that scenario doesn't exist in this car. So what's my verdict on the Renault Megane E-Tech here in Australia? Should you buy one? Well, if you love your Renaults, you've had them in the past, you really like that lightweight front drive, hot hatch sort of dynamic, or you just love the way this vehicle looks, I think you should go right ahead and really closely consider this vehicle. At about 60 grand drive away, the value for money isn't the best in the market, but it's also far from the worst. And if you've fallen in love with the concept and the aesthetic of this vehicle, then I personally wouldn't judge you at all for deciding to buy a Megane E-Tech. It's a cool car that's quite pleasant to drive. However, if you are purchasing on more objective grounds, you couldn't really overlook the fact that something like a base model Tesla Model 3 is significantly better value for money again. That being said, if you're already in the camp to be considering something as chic and Euro sophisticated as a Megane, you're probably not interested in something like a Tesla Model 3 to start with, and that's fine. The other car that I would definitely recommend you consider at a similar price point is the Cupra Born, which is achieving a similar mission, but with rear-wheel drive, so it does drive quite differently. Very keen to know your opinion, so please let me know down below this video in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell if you want to see more content just like this. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.